Welcome back to part 3 of Unit 0 Science Practices. This video is going to be talking about the different types of research methods within psychology. At the end of this video, you should be able to answer the questions: what is the difference between an experimental and non-experimental study? What are types of non-experimental research methods? What is the difference between using qualitative measurements and quantitative measurement tools? We're going to start by talking about experimental methodology. The most important thing to remember about experiments is that they determine cause and effect. We like to use the term experiment kind of interchangeably with research study, but I'm going to urge you in psychology to really use the term research study as kind of our catch-all. Experiment is a specific type of research studies. So in order to have a true experiment, you're going to have two things. First, you're going to have the manipulation of the independent variable. I am going to be changing something to see what the result is. And the second thing that's necessary is random assignment of participants into the control and experimental groups. The advantage of this experimental method, obviously, is that we determine causation. It is very clear what causes something to happen. And this allows us to make judgments about behavior. The disadvantage, however, is that it has very low ecological validity. Ecological validity is the idea that this would occur in the real world, right? This is valid for someone's normal experience. And when you're performing an experiment, in a laboratory, we take away that real world element. So we have low ecological validity. In addition, sometimes it's really difficult to manipulate variables in a way that's ethical. Sometimes we want to carry out an experiment, or we have questions about something that maybe we can't manipulate in a way that would be right for us to do. Experiments are often very expensive and hard to get approved by an IRB, which we'll talk about at the end of this unit. The next two types of experiments that we're going to talk about are subcategories of experiments. So remember, I talked about experiments done in laboratories are very difficult because they have low ecological validity. Sometimes researchers want to carry out an experiment, but they want to do it outside of that laboratory. In that case, we're going to call it a field experiment because we are actually carrying out the study in the real world instead of a lab. There's advantages to this, right? We can actually see how people are acting in the real world. However, we really have trouble controlling for extraneous or confounding variables, which are things that are outside of our independent variable that might have caused the change. The other type of experimental research that we might use is called a quasi-experiment. If we break that word down, the word quasi means fake. So technically, this is a fake experiment. The reason why this is considered fake is because the participants are not actually randomly assigned into either condition. So this takes away one of those two things we need for a true experiment. A quasi-experiment is done when we want to overcome that disadvantage of things that we can't ethically manipulate. So what this study might be is we are taking participants who are already grouped based on a trait or a behavior, and we're using those groups to see the differences between the two of them. For example, it's not ethical for us to take a group of pregnant women, randomly divide them into two groups and say, half of you are going to take drugs during your pregnancy and the other half are not. And then let's see what happens when someone takes drugs. We can't ethically do that in the real world. And so we would run a quasi-experiment. Unfortunately, there are women in the real world that take drugs when pregnant. And so we can compare those women to women who have healthy pregnancies, and we can see the changes that might have happened because drugs were taken during pregnancy. An advantage to this is we can see a specific relationship for things that would not be ethical to carry out in an experiment. The disadvantage for this is we're implying causation, we're not actually finding it. Okay, the next group of research studies that we're going to talk about are non-experimental methods. Remember, with experimental methods, we're really looking for that causation. For these next type of research studies, we are not finding any causation. These are just being used to make observations about behavior or mental processes without actually manipulating a variable. Some examples that we're going to talk about are surveys, naturalistic observations, case studies, and correlational studies. Again, these can determine relationships, but they cannot prove that one thing leads to another. The first method is a case study. A case study is an in-depth examination of either a special person or a small group of people. This person or this group of people might have something that is unique or special about them, or something that we cannot make happen in the real world. For example, one way that we study the brain is by looking at people who have brain injuries. When we see that they have a brain injury and then they have behavior deficits, we can make an assumption that that particular part of the brain that is damaged caused that behavior to happen. And since that person no longer has that specific functioning part of the brain, that behavior that is resulting from that structure will no longer happen. An advantage of this is that we can get information that we might not be able to see otherwise or ethically. We cannot give someone a brain injury. This also can lead to more research or more theories because we're observing things happening. There are two very distinct disadvantages for a case study, however. The first one is the most important. Because this is one person or a very small group of people, we cannot generalize this information. Just because you might be studying me doesn't mean my behavior or my thought processes are the same as other people. And so we cannot generalize the findings that we have in a case study to every single person. We have to do further research after it in order to make that generalization. And the second disadvantage is that case studies are really, really difficult to replicate. Even if we take multiple people with the same type of brain injury, that brain injury is going to be different on a case-by-case basis. And so the replication aspect of case studies are extremely difficult. The next type of non-experimental research we're going to talk about is a naturalistic observation. So a naturalistic observation is the recording and collecting of information from a natural environment. It's as if you are putting a video camera in a classroom and just watching what happens. The researcher is not interfering with the situation. They are not changing anything. They're just watching and they're taking a lot of notes. The researcher is going to write down and observe everything that is happening in that environment in order to determine how might people behave in a specific environment. Obviously, there's some advantages to this. We get really detailed information about behavior of individuals in a real world scenario. There's no cause and effect. And there's also some ethical considerations to be concerned about. Like, do people know that they're being watched? And is it ethical to just watch something happen? Maybe it's something bad and not step in and do something. The next type of study we're going to talk about is a correlational study. Correlational studies often get mixed up with experiments, and it's very important to know the difference. First and foremost, correlational studies have the root word of relation inside of it. Correlational studies determine a relationship between two variables without manipulating either one of those variables. Okay, so correlational studies do not have an independent variable. We are not changing anything. We're just looking at two factors and we're determining, do they seem to have any sort of relationship between them? The advantage of using correlational studies are that they're more efficient, they're cost effective, they're easier. We can look at factors that might not be possible in an experiment. However, one of the things that we often run into with correlational studies, incorrect or illusory correlations or illusory relationships. And what this means is that we see some sort of relationship when there isn't actually a relationship there. In order to carry out correlational studies, we sometimes use different techniques in order to figure out some information. One of the best and easiest ways to gather information about people is using a survey. And this can be through a questionnaire or an in-person interview with someone. And really, this is our chance of gathering information about someone's beliefs, characteristics, or behaviors. This is super easy, it's cheap, it's efficient. We get a lot of information from a very large group of people really quickly, but there are distinct disadvantages when it comes to surveys. The first is that we don't always get accurate results. The wording of the survey can sometimes lead to incorrect responses or responses that maybe have been framed a certain way. The self-report bias is the idea that our answers might deviate if we're answering about ourselves. We might make ourselves look better in a certain situation. We don't want to reveal certain information about ourselves. Maybe we're embarrassed or we're exaggerating to make ourselves look a little bit cooler or better in a particular situation. The social desirability bias is the idea that we might answer a question like the researcher wants us to look. For example, if I am giving a survey to high school students about alcohol use, they might answer in a way that is untrue or makes them look better than if they were just talking amongst their friends about their alcohol use. The last type of research method we're going to talk about is called meta-analysis. Meta-analysis is not really carrying out your own research. It's taking research from multiple studies that have already been done and comparing them to one another. And we're analyzing that research. It's giving us overall or general conclusions about a particular topic. For example, if I'm really interested in teenage sleep, I might go to the internet or my research database and I might gather all of the research studies done on teens and sleep in the last 10 years. Then I'm going to read through that research. I'm going to gather a bunch of evidence, and I'm going to make an overall conclusion about teens and sleep based on all of the data that I have collected. This is referred to as a meta-analysis. So all of these research methods that we've talked about will provide us with data. And we break data down into two different types of data that we can receive. The first is qualitative data. Qualitative data we might get from a survey. This would be that narrative, open-ended answer to a question. It might be from an interview or observation. Quantitative data, on the other hand, is using numbers or values. This is actually quantifiable. So one place that students often get confused is the Likert scale. So Likert scales are when I ask you to rate on a scale of like 1 to 7, from 1 being not at all and 7 being all the time, how often you watch TV. That is called a Likert scale. Now, you might get confused because you are answering based on words, right? Not at all or all the time. But we can quantify those using a 1 and a 7, and that gives us that quantitative data. So all of these research methods that we've talked about in this video will gather data either in the qualitative form, like that narrative or open-ended, or the quantitative form with values and numbers. And we will talk about how we analyze that data in another video.